So when I told a close family member last semester that I was going to do an art series project about the effects of rape culture on young girls, the first thing that she said to me was, "Why don't you paint the seasons or trees instead?" That small 5-second exchange made me realize that this family member represents how our entire culture deals with the rape epidemic in this country, which is by not dealing with it at all. 1 in 3 women will experience either sexual or physical violence within their lifetime. If a terminal cancer, let's just say, was to affect 1 in 3 people, the government would be doing everything in its power to stop it. Just think back to how our nation freaked out about the slightest possibility of an Ebola outbreak a few years ago. Disease epidemics like Ebola and cancer are visible. We see the pain, we talk about it, we educate ourselves about the disease and what can be done to eradicate it. And yet, the sexual violence epidemic in this country is not visible, and that 1 in 3 statistic isn't treated with the same amount of merit. We don't want to think about the fact that in a kindergarten classroom with 15 little girls, at least 5 of them will get raped or sexually assaulted, some within the next 10 years, as 44% of victims are under the age of 18. We don't want to think about how disturbing those numbers really are. And if we can't talk about these issues, despite how uncomfortable they make us feel, how are survivors of sexual violence supposed to feel comfortable enough to speak up? And more so, how are we supposed to educate our youth about sexual violence and rape culture and make them feel comfortable enough to want to ask questions when we ourselves aren't even comfortable enough to talk about it or ask questions? We normalize rape culture and denormalize the conversation surrounding it. But what if we lived in a world where this ideology was reversed? What if we denormalized rape culture and normalized the conversation surrounding it? Sexual violence would take 1 step closer to no longer becoming an epidemic. And we have the power to make this happen, but it involves addressing the problem from its roots, which is actually much earlier than elementary school. So before we go any further, I just want to take a moment to define what sexual violence and rape culture are. Sexual violence, according to the CDC, is a sexual act committed against someone without that person's freely given consent. Consent is an affirmative yes and not the absence of no. Rape culture, on the other hand, is how our language, media, and facets of everyday life normalize violence against women to the point where rape seems inevitable. And I also want to make it very clear that men and people of all genders can be victims of sexual violence. However, this talk in particular will primarily focus on this issue in regards to women. So how can a child as young as 3 or 4 years old experience the effects of rape culture before actually knowing what rape and rape culture are? The answer boils down to something called microaggressions, which are seemingly harmless comments and actions that perpetrate a perceived harmful ideology. So, for example, let's say that Melissa, a 4-year-old girl, is playing on the playground when a boy starts teasing her. He is pulling at her hair and tugging at her clothes, although Melissa has told him to stop. Melissa then runs to her mom, visibly upset, and explains what happened. The response? "Honey, he's just mean to you because he likes you. That's how boys are." Now, Melissa's mom probably meant no harm at all in telling this to her daughter. Yet in her dismissing that boy's behavior as normal and a symbol of flattery, Melissa learns that this mistreatment of her is okay and that it should be expected. And the next time that Melissa is faced with a similar situation, she may not go and seek help because according to the last adult she told, there is nothing to seek help for. Now think for a second about how this may relate back to sexual violence. 68% of rapes are not reported to the police, and 98% of rapists will never face a day in jail or prison for their actions. Maybe when Melissa is in high school and her boyfriend is pressuring her to do a little more than she's comfortable with, she decides to not say anything because he still likes me but is just being a little rough right now. And by the time that Melissa realizes that something isn't right, it may already be too late. And this normalization of violence is not just an idea that has been planted into Melissa's head. It's an ideology that's been planted into the mind of that little boy as well. We are sending him a message that harassment towards girls is considered cute and a sign of affection. And yet, when that boy grows up to become a teenager and he touches a girl without her permission, now it's suddenly not okay. Think about the rationale behind why some men catcall. Commenting on women's bodies and expecting a smile or sign of appreciation is not much different from what that boy's rationale was on the playground. Rape culture starts early, and it's an ideology that has infiltrated our systems and institutions, specifically our schools. Lucinda Ventimiglia, who was a senior at Stuyvesant High School in 2012, was told that even though her skirts were at a technically acceptable length, she should follow a separate dress code where her skirts end at her knees. Girls who are tall and or curvy are disproportionately affected by dress code regulations, and it's a pattern that is seen across this country. The need to monitor female attire for a distraction-free learning environment sends a dangerous message, which is that girls are responsible for how society objectifies and sexualizes them, and that the boys who the system is supposedly catering to are biologically predisposed to harass women. When a girl gets sent home from school for wearing leggings, a tank top, or shorts, she learns that her sexuality and the education of her male peers takes priority over her learning. Women and girls are not sexual objects, yet through dress code, we continue to penalize women for the choices that they make with their own bodies. And when a woman gets raped, it is no coincidence that the go-to question is always, what was she wearing? And although this rape culture ideology has infiltrated our schools, lessons about rape culture, sexual violence, and sex in general are largely absent from our education curriculum. Only 20 US states out of the 50 even require public schools to teach sex and HIV education. Our children have the right to medically accurate and developmentally appropriate information about sex and sexuality, especially at the high school level, having lessons on what consists of a healthy relationship and lessons on what consent is and how to ask for it are all vital in preventing sexual violence within future generations. Yet, in our efforts to create a sex ed program that's comprehensive, we need to be mindful of our language and how we address the topic. According to the Gluck-Meitner Institute, 20 US states require that schools teach, and I quote, skills for avoiding coerced sex. Instead of just telling our students to avoid coerced sex, we should be teaching them to not coerce others into sex in the first place. The wording of this mandate, although done with very good intentions, I'm sure, is actually a form of victim blaming. Coerced sex is rape. And telling our students that they need to develop a skill set to avoid rape is contributing to the rape culture itself. So then, how should we approach sex education in this country? Well, if rape culture in our society is perpetrated so early on, we shouldn't have to wait until middle school or high school to teach our children about emotional and sexuality education. The ideas of body awareness and comfortable versus uncomfortable intimacy are ideas that can and should be taught to our children starting in kindergarten. the Netherlands has actually adopted a system like this in their schools, which they call comprehensive sexuality education. Children, starting at the age of 4, learn about intimacy, personal boundaries, and the communication tools needed to address these issues. And again, the key here is developmentally appropriate education. In my own education classes at Adelphi, we talk about a teaching strategy called scaffolding, which is when the learning of more complex concepts is built off the student's prior understanding. So teaching consent, for example, can be done in kindergarten by having a discussion about hugs. It feels good to get a hug, and the people who we hug are people that we love and care about. But what if someone ran up to you from behind and hugged you? You may feel a little startled, right? So what do you think you should do if you really want to hug someone, but you aren't quite sure if that person wants a hug? You ask them first. And if that person says that they want a hug and they seem really excited about getting a hug, then give them a hug. But if that person says that they don't want a hug, even if they wanted a hug yesterday, respect their space and don't hug them. See how this analogy could easily connect to how we as adults think of consent? When a young child is able to grasp the concept of consent through a situation that's familiar to them, it can be easily understood in more sexually mature situations as the child develops. Just like in learning math, science, or literacy, students are better able to use knowledge and skills independently when they are given the support and exposure to these topics early on. And statistically, this comprehensive sex ed model has been working for the Netherlands. A study done in 2011 found that most sexually active 12 to 25-year-olds in the Netherlands had first-time sexual experiences that were wanted and fun. A 2008 United Nations report found that comprehensive sex ed, when taught effectively, allows young people to make more informed choices about their sexual lives. We can incorporate comprehensive sex ed into our schools in the United States. Authors and illustrators can work with the Department of Education to create teaching tools for this purpose. Seminars for parents and educators can be offered so they can be a part of this process too. It's a solution that is very doable and one that we all should strive for. Yet, until this happens, there are steps that we all can take to help eradicate rape culture and sexual violence. Being more mindful of our interactions with others and stopping microaggressions when we see them are two really good places to start. So, for example, if you see a woman walking down the street wearing a revealing top and short shorts, respect her choices. If you are a student and you hear someone making a rape joke in the cafeteria, shut it down. If you are a parent, treat your daughters with the same respect that you treat your sons. Teach them that abuse does not equal love. And I'm not trying to argue that eradicating rape culture or sexual violence will be easy, as it's so challenging to undo a practice that has such deep roots within our history. Yet, opening up the conversation surrounding issues of gender inequality and sexual violence will start to create those small ripples which are necessary in creating much bigger waves. Organizations like Goldie Blocks and the It's On Us campaign have given us a glimpse of this already. Social media is another great outlet to spread awareness of this issue, and the Yes All Women movement is a prime example of this. Increased dialogue about sexual violence will lead to increased awareness, which will allow survivors to feel more comfortable in sharing their stories. It wasn't until I went to my university's Take Back the Night last year that I realized how many women and people I cared about were affected by sexual violence. And although hearing those brave individuals share their stories made me feel less alone in my own experiences, I was consumed with anger over the fact that this issue is so prevalent. No woman or person should ever have to suffer from rape, abuse, or assault. At least, not in silence. And this is why I am here today, because I believe in a world without sexual violence, a world where little girls can grow up feeling empowered and fearless. I have made the decision to fight for this better world, yet it is not a fight that I can win on my own. Every single person watching this right now has the ability to make strides towards creating a rape-free culture. Spreading awareness through our voices, our social media, and our art are just a few ways of approaching this. If we can work together to shed some light onto this darkness, I believe that we can create this better world for all of us. Thank you.